Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Kevin Yuill, and we're going to talk about a humanist case against assisted suicide. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think a good first question is what you understand humanism to be.
It is a very good question. It's a very complex one. On one hand, it refers to atheism, a basic disbelief in God. So I think that's part of it. But second, I think it's also involved with the sort of rational autonomous self as the center of humanism. So we're blessed, we're endowed, blessed is perhaps the wrong word, but we're endowed with the ability to think for ourselves, to make decisions for ourselves. And I think that's a very important part of humanism. On the very base level, it means I don't believe in God.
Okay, so in a sense, what you're providing is a secular argument against assisted suicide.
Absolutely right. Although I would add that whenever I listen to religious people, they often make, arguments against assisted suicide, which are from a secular perspective. But, they are sort of accused of being religious. So many of the arguments that I make are very similar to those that religious people make.
Okay. So how would you summarize your argument, this secular argument against assisted suicide?
Well, I think there are three aspects to it. First of all, I think there's a misrepresentation of the whole case for assisted suicide, in that it's based on a fearful idea of what dying and death is like. So it takes dying and death and it uses that very emotive kind of scenario, which is that there is a person dying in a bed, there are anxious relatives looking towards the doctor, and the doctor wrings her hands and says, there's nothing more I can do because it's illegal, as this poor soul in the bed begs to die. And of course, as hospice doctors who oppose assisted suicide, legalization of assisted suicide more than anybody else, more than by 82%, which is sort of the highest level that I've ever heard people opposing legalization. As they point out, this isn't the reality of death. This is a fear of dying, but it's not the reality of the way most people die. That's not to say that there aren't people who die in painful situations, and I've witnessed this with my own family, but it's to say that in general people die peacefully and that we shouldn't fear that very end of life. So I think in a lot of ways the first aspect is that this is misrepresented by those who are arguing for a change in the law. The second thing that I think is wrong with it is that it's actually harmful. So what we've seen in Canada, where people who feel like a burden, where people are encouraged in many ways to feel as a burden and feel and use assisted suicide and or euthanasia, because 99% of medical aid in dying, as it's called there, is actually euthanasia. So people are encouraged to use that. And I think just as I would regret, as somebody who opposes the death penalty, I would regret any innocent person being wrongfully convicted and killed in the United States where it's legal. Similarly, I think we should really be concerned about the people who are wrongfully sentenced to die by medical aid in dying. And I think there are actually real harms. In the Netherlands, just as an example, there have been at least 8 cases and doubtless many more of autistic people who have had euthanasia simply because they could not cope with the outside world, they could not cope with changes. And I think that's actually harms various different individuals. Third and last is the moral case really against assisted suicide. I think it undermines our efforts to prevent suicide in people when we say, you know what, you might as well jump. I think that's the wrong message to put across, and I think it undermines our humanism, our human solidarity, if you like. And I think that is the probably for me the most important reason to oppose it.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to try to summarize what I've heard so far. So there are three reasons. The first one is that you think that people have a misunderstanding of how most people die, and those in favor of assisted death often have a particular picture of a person who's in extreme pain at the end of their lives, right? But that's not how most people die. Perhaps most people actually die in their sleep because of the drugs that they're on or something like that. So they're not suffering as much as the typical pro-assisted suicide person would have us think.
Yes, that's the point. I mean, if you look at the Oregon reasons why people opt for assisted suicide, where it's been legal since 1997, then you can see that pain doesn't even come in the top 5 reasons and never has in any of the reports that have come out. So fear of physical pain is not the issue. It's existential pain that I think that existential being trapped in a body that you no longer want to be in is, I think, what people really fear. And it's not something that I think we need to fear.
Okay. And the second reason is that you think that legalizing assisted suicide places or encourages some people to choose that option because they feel like they're a burden to others. And so it actually causes harm in that way.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And then the third is the moral argument you're saying. Can you elaborate on that third point?
Well, yes, I think if, we're faced with the sort of the proverbial man teetering on the ledge, and we are asked to give that man a push. And I think it's destructive to our humanity to actually do it. My emphasis is not on the poor person who is in that invidious situation, who is begging in that situation. That's very understandable. And, I've been in that situation where somebody is begging to die. And I think that's understandable. What I don't think is permissible is for us to say, yes, your life is that wretched that we're going to not only encourage you to jump, but give you a push off of that ledge. And I think that's what's destructive to our own human solidarity. And part of it is, of course, that society has a duty to protect people, and sometimes from themselves. I think that's in the nature of society. We don't distinguish murder cases between somebody who's 86 and doesn't really want to live and somebody who's 24 and has their entire life ahead of them. What we would say that to murder either of them, to take their lives, is equally wicked act. And I think this undermines that. It divides society into two different groups of people, one of whom we say we're going to strenuously try and prevent your suicide, and the others where we say, look, would you like a wheelchair ramp and we'll help you off of that ledge. I think that is a sort of a bad aspect of it. If I can add one other thing, I think as a historian, what I've seen in the past is that when this is introduced, it is introduced always with two reasons. It first emerged in 1870 at the Birmingham Speculative Club in England, where Samuel, and I'm trying to remember his last name, Samuel Williams, I did remember it, is presented this idea. And as he made the point, this is about compassion, and I do believe that compassion is part of the motivation why people think that this is a good idea, but it's always with utility as well. And this is the dividing line. If you ever challenge somebody who's in favor and say, where do you divide between people who should be eligible for assisted suicide and people who shouldn't, it always has a utilitarian aspect to it. Very, very few people say, do you know what? Everybody should be entitled to an assisted suicide because they are autonomous people, including, for instance, nobody goes as far as saying, well, the German cannibals who, agreed with each other that they would kill and eat each other, that their rights should be protected. Very, very few people say, well, everybody should have the death that they want. They always divide it between some people who are eligible and some people who aren't. And when you challenge them to really draw that line and justify it, it's very, very difficult to do.
I want to dive deeper into like this moral argument, and then I'm going to go back to the other points that you mentioned, because I think they're all interrelated. So in terms of, the person who is standing on the edge of the bridge, right? You're saying what we should do is prevent that person from jumping, right? We should do what we can to improve that person's quality of life so that they don't want to die anymore.
To save a life, yes.
Yeah, that we opt to save this person's life. But if we legalize assisted death, then what we're doing is actually pushing this person off the bridge.
Yes.
Okay. Now, why couldn't that be understood as a way of being, a way of being compassionate and being in solidarity with each other? Because I think what's part of the human condition is suffering. It may not, I think pain is obviously part of the human condition, but I think it's understandable that people have experience existential suffering at the end of their lives, especially when they, maybe perhaps can't control their bodies anymore. And I think we can all kind of imagine how that would be for ourselves. And that empathy perhaps may drive us to help others in those conditions, right? So you mentioned, we should save people's lives. We want to help this person out. But it seems that for some people, perhaps there may not be a way to help them. For some people there may be, but for some people, I kind of leave open the possibility that for some people there really isn't a better alternative, So what would you say in response to that?
Well, in some ways I agree with you. I do think that there are cases, individual cases, that there is very little that you can do. And I'm not opposed to assisted suicide per se. What I'm opposed to is a change in the law. And the signal that gives is what we're talking about right at the moment. And I think, many people go through many parts of their lives, occasionally thinking, this is awful, this is terrible, I don't want to go on. And yes, of course, we should have empathy for that person, but that doesn't mean that we should offer them a push or encourage them to suicide. We don't know the person who's standing up on the ledge, what they are thinking, why they are thinking it. And I think it comes down to what can we assume that they must have going on in them. And I think the assumption should be to save a life, to actually deal with human problems in a human way, in actually talking to that person, in discussing with them how they feel. And this is a lot of the work that goes on in hospices. It's to take people who are very understandably upset and depressed and forlorn about the future, and to talk to them and say, well, what can you do with the rest of this time? What do you want to do with this time? What are your fears, etc.? I think that's the way to deal with these situations, rather than to say, do you know what? You might as well go. Yes, your life looks absolutely terrible, and I think, there's no point living anymore. I suppose that's the essence of my moral objection, is that there is a human solidarity that really, it rips apart that fabric of human life, I suppose.
I don't know if that's true for most people, but at least for me, when I think about this issue, I often think about my own life and what I would want at the end, and then from that I kind of extrapolate the option of having it for other people, that other people should have access to it or not. And I would agree with you that there are different ways to address existential suffering, or the suffering that you experience at the end of life. Are you concerned that by legalizing assisted suicide or having it more socially acceptable, that we would de-emphasize other ways of addressing existential suffering?
Well, yes, and I think the evidence shows in Canada that is used at times. It's not hugely extensive, thank goodness, but I do think the more it becomes an option, the more people get sort of pushed into that channel. And I think that, and a lot of these issues are existential. We've seen the examples in Canada of a person who is too poor to move out of a house that in which she was suffering from all sorts of allergies. It's an easy material problem to solve, but not an easy problem to solve if you are that person. And she was granted a euthanasia. And I think that's really the wrong approach to things. And as I say, evidence shows that that's the way it would go. Just to come back on what you just said, I mean, I can understand for anybody's own life to imagine in the future, we've all felt very bad. We've all felt sick. We've probably all done the whole thing of drinking too much and saying, please God, if you let me live and get me over this, I will never drink again. We've all been there. And we've all probably been at very down parts of our life as well. And I think one of the things, and this sounds very patronizing, but you're a young man. You can't possibly imagine, as I couldn't when I was a young man, what it would be like to be older, what it would be like to be in a different situation. And I think too many people spend too much time imagining, what will my moment of death be? And in what we should be looking at really is what can I do with my life? I think there's a sort of, there's a historical element that really has emerged since the 1970s that I think is very interesting in the way that people imagine their lives and people look at their lives. I don't know whether are you a sociologist?
I'm not. I'm a philosopher by training.
Philosopher, okay. But you might know Christopher Lasch. Do you know Christopher Lasch at all?
I might have read his work. I'm not sure.
Yes, Culture of Narcissism. And he makes a very good point that there is a feeling of that people are cut off from the future and cut off from the past and cannot see their lives as part of a sort of whole. And so there's this tendency to imagine yourself onto, your 80-year-old self. And of course, you will be a different person by the time you get that age. And I think this is one of the problems is that people foresee their lives. If I can just sort of take your example of you imagining yourself at an older age, I think we should just cross that bridge when we come to it, is the expression, I guess, that is most applicable.
I want to get back to this point that you made about us dividing people into two groups, those who, I guess, deserve suicide prevention and those that we think deserve assisted suicide. On principle, I don't see a necessary problem with that. And I think it's because different people's lives are just different, right? Just like any other medical option or intervention is not going to be appropriate for every person, something like assisted suicide is not going to be appropriate for every person. So I think the person who's standing on the bridge and was about to jump, I would agree that overall that we should prevent people from committing suicide. And I think it's supported by the data, right? Like if you look at the data, it says that most people who attempt suicide do not reattempt. And most suicide attempts are impulsive, right? So that tells me that if we don't have much information about this person at all, like I'm just driving and I see this person standing on the ledge, that means that I should try to stop that person, right? But I think that reasoning comes down to autonomy, and I think it's closely connected with well-being too, right? So given the fact that most people don't reattempt, and given the fact that attempts are impulsive, that suggests that most suicide attempts are not autonomous choices. Perhaps the person has experienced something very terrible and they're acting out emotionally. It's not a well thought out, consistent and persistent wish. So that would be the vast majority of cases. But for the minority of cases, I can imagine suicide being a rational choice. The person has thought through the issue. They've thought about the alternatives, right? They understand the information, they have decision-making capacity, right? And after a period of time, they still wish to die because they think it's best for them. Then I would place them in the other category. So I guess in principle, I'm not against placing people in those two categories.
Yes, I can see what you're saying. I would just say that suicide, to have any meaning as suicide is occasionally, as you say, a rational act. I completely agree with you on that. And I can think of examples in history where it's rational. And it even can be a beautiful act in some ways. I'm not sure whether you know the story of Captain Oates of the Antarctic. It may not be.
Yeah, I think I read it in your book.
Right. Yes. Well, it may not be familiar to Americans as much as it is to British people, but it is somebody who sacrificed himself for the good of his company so that they had a better chance of actually making it. Now, that is a rational act. That is a suicide, but it's a very good act. So I do think that there are different suicides that can occur. But where we perhaps differ is that I think from outside of the suicide, the actual person, we cannot judge that person's life is not worth saving. We have to decide that person is worth saving. Now, of course, you could, a kind of example, I'm trying to think of one, but I think if you were passing a lake and there was somebody drowning in it, most of the time we would assume that person was a good person. That person could be a horrible person. And in fact, the world could be a better place if they drowned. But we have to assume that person is good, is worth having in the world, but also that to save their life is a virtuous act. And virtuous acts are things that are good and things that we want to have in our society as an example to other people, perhaps.
I mean, I think that example is comparable to the person standing on the bridge, right? Like, you don't know anything about that person. But also for a person who's drowning, I guess one distinction I would make is that I wouldn't necessarily think that there was some suicide attempt going on there, whereas a person standing on the edge of a bridge, like that seems like, oh, this person might jump. But yeah, I see what you're saying, right? There's some intrinsic value, perhaps, of being a human being who's like also alive, right? And this kind of leads to my next question, which is, how much of your argument rests on this idea of the sanctity of life?
Actually, quite a bit, I suppose. It sounds odd for a secularist to be talking about the sanctity of life, but I do think that we observe sanctity in many different arenas. So, for instance, even if I don't believe in God, I still have a sort of respect for the dead, the human dead, that I might, that is not particularly, very difficult to justify in rational terms, but there is a sort of sacral nature to various different aspects of life. And I do think that we have, part of civilization is to actually have an equal regard for each human being, whatever their circumstances, and that we regard human existence as a good, and we regard other people's existence as a good, and that we try and help other people like that. Sorry, I'm losing the train of my thought as we're going along. Please repeat the question, and I'll start again if you like.
I think you answered it. It was about the sanctity of life question. So I kind of want to ask you about your view on, I guess, when a suicide is permissible, because I think it's interesting. Your position is nuanced, right? You're saying that suicide should be reserved as a private act. So what you seem to be against is the medicalization of it, right? It shouldn't be something that is, it shouldn't be an option when you're at the hospital for, assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's something that should be taken in the privacy, perhaps, of your own home or something like that. And I kind of want you to elaborate on why you think that.
Well, it's connected to your last question in some ways, of course, because I think the sacral nature of life is, in fact, where we regard life as serious enough that we don't just reduce it to a menu choice, existence or non-existence. It shouldn't be a menu choice. It should be, as Shakespeare said, to be or not to be, a profound question that each individual in some ways must ask at various points of their life. And I think that's in some ways the key to it. Are you familiar with Hannah Arendt's theory of action?
I am not.
Okay. Hannah Arendt is, as a historian, you come upon these people and you read them and you think, where have you been? It's why I get more and more interested in philosophy as I go along, is because there are some really, really interesting thinkers, and she's one of those thinkers. And she talked about a theory of action, that there was actions that we take that have repercussions of the world, and we don't know what the repercussions are going to be. And so I think of suicide as an action like that. It's something that it's unpredictable. So I think I use these examples in the book. I talked about the Libyan man who set himself on fire out of frustration and then really inspired the 2011 Arab Spring revolts. And yet there's a poor woman in Iran who set herself on fire, self-immolation as an expression, and nobody has heard of her, and her action did not work. It didn't set off the what she hoped would happen, which was a great attack on the regime in Tehran. And so I think it's the medicalization of choice, the reduction of human life to a medical condition of alive and dead, and existent or non-existent, that I think is something that's threatened by the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. I think it can be a really problematic thing. Suicide being a private act, I think it's important because it has, first of all, I am a great believer in individual freedom. So therefore, I'm with John Stuart Mill that, if you are going up on a creaky and unsafe bridge, I should tell you about it, but I cannot prevent you from going up there. I think it's very important to have human freedom to, refuse medical treatment, to refuse food and drink. I think these are part of human freedom. All free, competent adults should not have their shoelaces taken from them or their belts taken away in the hopes that they won't commit suicide. It is always an option for each individual. The part I object to, as I stress, is in my book and elsewhere, is the participation of society in that person's suicidal ideation. In that, I keep on coming back to this example, but it's the man on the ledge. What do you do when you come across the man on the ledge? And that's not to say that there aren't legitimate assisted suicides, which I would put with, I've forgotten the name of the monk in Vietnam, who people will be familiar with because of the Rage Against the Machine album cover. But he had somebody else pour petrol on him after weeks and weeks of consideration. So there are situations where that works. But what I don't think is right is just to say, you know what, you can take this, you don't need to justify it, you don't need to do anything about it. It's just an option that you have. And our entire input as society is not to say, no, you should step away from that precipice. It's to be neutral. And I think that's almost as problematic as the whole idea that we should push people. We should never be neutral about human life.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I see the legalization of assisted suicide as a manifestation of us viewing suicide in a neutral way. Perhaps I'm just speculating here, but my guess is that the vast majority of doctors don't want their patients to die, right? At most times, right? Like if they could save a patient's life, that they would. If they could prevent a patient's suffering, they would, right? It's almost like you face this very bad situation and you are allowing the patient to choose the option that they think will lead to less suffering. And I'm glad that you brought up the case of people having the right to refuse care, even when it's life-sustaining, because I think a lot of the pro-assisted suicide people, they will make a moral comparison between declining life-sustaining care and assisted suicide. I would say that I fall into that camp. I don't see how they're morally different, especially when you have cases of somebody, somebody who's refusing artificially administered nutrition and hydration, right? So let's say somebody who's, paralyzed and, obviously they maybe they have like a peg tube or something, and somebody has to remove it, right? They can't do it themselves. So in a sense, like I would consider that to be a form of assisted suicide that we currently already allow. So if we want to be consistent, and I think that we should be, then we should also allow other cases of assisted suicide, as long as they're morally comparable.
Well, I disagree with you in the sense that I think that there's a huge moral difference between allowing somebody to go down their own path, allowing somebody to refuse treatment or food and drink that I would know that would save their lives. I think people must have that right to be able to refuse unwanted treatment, unwanted food and drink. I think that there's a difference. And if they say, remove that tube and that, that is unwanted treatment, then I think that we have to do, even if we disagree with their decision. Whereas I think assisted suicide goes a step further. And I think there is a big moral leap between somebody saying, I want to go and walk on this rickety bridge. There's nothing you can do to stop me. And I think, well, yes, I can't stop you, and I shouldn't be allowed to stop you. And please give me a push. And I think that's a massive moral difference. Then I'm a participant in that death. Whereas if you simply stop treatment, even futile treatment that doctors would prevent, I don't think that's with the idea of killing somebody. Whereas you are taking an active part in killing somebody by assisting a suicide. And I think that's the moral trap that it allows.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on James Rachel's hypothetical, right, of the person who is in a position to gain some inheritance. I think if their relative dies, right, it's like a child, right. In the first scenario, the person actively drowns the child. In the second scenario, the child is already going to take a bath, but then slips and hits his head, and so falls unconscious under the water. And the person doesn't have to actually forcibly drown the child, but just kind of stands back and waits for the child to drown. Rachel's is saying, look, there's not really a moral difference between these two scenarios, even though one is characterized by letting die and the other is characterized by killing. What do you think about that?
Well, I think Rachel's mistaken in the first place, because there is such a thing as a duty of care to a child or some young person who is incompetent. I think adults have to care, and it's right to charge adults with the death of a child if they do not care for that child. So I don't even accept Rachel's initial kind of idea. Now, if that was a competent adult who was taking a bath and you saw him slip and hurt his head, then would it be different? I think it would be, in the sense that if you saw the competent adult, I think in some ways morally there is a difference between me taking advantage of a situation if I walked past this competent adult who had slipped and hurt their head and was drowning, and me holding their head under the water. I think there's a clear moral difference. In one, I'm participating in the death. In the other, I am not participating in the death. And much as I think it's not morally obnoxious not to save a person when you can save that person, I don't think the two are morally equivalent. I can't see that you can argue that holding somebody's head under the water is the same as walking past whilst somebody's drowning.
Another example that comes to mind is, so let's say somebody is intubated, right? And if you extubate them, then you're letting them die perhaps from their underlying condition, and that's not as bad as, euthanizing them. Let's say that I went into a hospital and I just extubate all these patients, right? It seems weird to say that I did not kill those patients, that I merely allowed them to die from their underlying condition, right? It seems, morally speaking, that I did kill those patients.
Yes, because you have duty of care. These are not competent adults, independent, in the same way that you and I are at this very moment. These are people who are in a hospital. They are obviously very vulnerable, and therefore to remove their tubes is to remove, unless it's a clinical decision. I think doctors should have the right to stop futile treatment. But if you or I went into a hospital and did that, we would be guilty of murder.
Yeah, so then the duty of care aspect then almost makes the letting die versus killing distinction mute. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that we have generally a duty to people who are in our care, who are not competent or vulnerable. That would take, an incompetent adult some adult who is in a hospital situation, so they're in a care situation. There's no equal relationship between the doctor and the patient. The doctor has to be in charge of that patient and their treatment. And a child, an adult and a child. An adult obviously has a certain duty of care for a child. And, to not save a child who is in our care. And if you went to a court of law, I'm sure that James Rachel's person who walked past the child drowning would be convicted of, failure to care. I think if you're in that situation, you are placed in the care of that person. It's different than if there is a competent adult who has made a decision in certain circumstances to walk across a rickety bridge, and that we don't have the right to stop that person from doing so. They are doing so because they're a competent adult. They're the equal of you or I. These other cases, the ones that Rachel uses, the ones that you've just used, are not equal in moral status to either of us, or most people out on the street, most people who count themselves as competent adults.
I think what makes the situation complicated, or what makes this issue complicated, is first, there are the causal mechanisms at play, right? Like if we kind of extrapolate the moral element of these actions, what we're trying to figure out is causation, right? If I let somebody die, then I am not the cause of their death. So if I kill somebody, then I am the cause of their death, right? But because we're talking about something like, human life and the value of life, there is this moral element that seems to be intertwined with it, and that's influencing how we decide what to call, right and wrong, or even how we define allowing die versus killing, right? Because you may think, morally speaking, if you have this duty to care, it doesn't matter, the letting die and killing distinction doesn't matter, because they're both wrong. Maybe, if you're in a situation that you're supposed to take care of somebody else, right? Maybe the killing versus letting die distinction only matters when there isn't a duty to care.
There's such a thing as intention as well, though, that I think comes into this. And I think if it's our intention to let somebody die, that's essentially a moral equivalent of killing them, of not saving them when we can easily save them. I think if our intention is to do that, but it's very difficult to interrogate intentions. All I think we can do in relation to assisted suicide is not to allow people to assist any suicide in almost any circumstance. And if it does, just keep the law against it is what my argument is, and keep the moral idea that we should prevent people from killing themselves whenever we can. And in certain circumstances, we turn away. I think, keep the law, keep the general moral rule, and allow for individual circumstances where it is not particularly applicable. I think that's the way we've operated. Well, certainly, are you in the States?
I am.
Yes. And if you're not in one of the states where it's legal, then that's how we've operated for a very long time. And it doesn't seem to me to cause huge amounts of problems. And in fact, if we don't shine the moral spotlight on, or the legal spotlight more applicably, on the deathbed scene, then we can actually make these kind of decisions. Doctors can make these decisions when it's absolutely necessary. In the UK, we have quite a good kind of arrangement at the moment where the Director of Public Prosecutions has said to police forces, we do not prosecute cases involving mercy killings without consulting somebody else, consulting the Director of Public Prosecutions. And that deals with the very, very few cases each year where somebody is accused of this kind of crime. So between 2009 and 2020, there were 4 successful prosecutions under the 1961 Suicide Act, of which Section 2 gives a 14-year sentence for assisting a suicide. And, 4 prosecutions tells me that law is working very, very well, and that it has a kind heart but a stern face, and that's what we require of law. We require law to set a sort of moral standard. And I think that's what's dangerous about changing this one.
So I can understand when it comes to adults that they're experiencing existential suffering and perhaps that there are other options available other than death. But what about the case of infants? Do you think euthanasia is justified in some cases for infants who are expected to suffer and then die?
That's a very, very difficult question. And I have to say, I am not on one side or the other of that. I can see the arguments in favor of infant euthanasia. I can see them from a sense that I've heard. I have a friend who runs an abortion service, and so therefore has to deal with these issues. We occasionally discuss them. And I can see that first of all, is an infant a person is a very, very difficult question to answer. It's certainly a potential person, and I think in law we should regard it as a person. It would make no sense to extend abortion to retroactive abortion, as my father used to threaten me with, but even, months, I don't think it makes any sense. So I can see the arguments that an infant is not in the same category as somebody who's older and is certainly a person by, who can understand right from wrong, the Kantian kind of moral person. So I can see that, but on the other hand, I can also see that in general, it is killing a human being, which if somebody came along and murdered an infant, we would put them in prison because it's wrong. So I think it's the action of killing that is the really problematic aspect, not only of that example that you've just given, but also of assisted suicide and euthanasia.
Something that you mentioned there, I think it's worth emphasizing, which is the difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia. It doesn't sound like you think that they're morally different.
I do think that they're morally different in the sense that they have very different moral repercussions. In one, we were watching somebody kind of take an action that we could be preventing. So it's assisted suicide. We could actually put our hand out and stop the person from taking the poison that they were using. On the other, it is directly causing a human life to end. And I think the two have different moral implications. But it's in the same light as, for instance, if there were 3 robbers, one with a gun, who go and rob somebody, and one of the robbers says, let him have it, and the person with a gun shoots, then the robber who said, let him have it, is part of that killing and must be judged for that. So I think assisted suicide is in that camp. But yes, strictly speaking, there is a difference between pulling the trigger and simply encouraging somebody to pull the trigger.
So you think assisted suicide is less wrong than euthanasia?
No, because I think it's still participating in a death. I just think it's got different moral implications that we should be aware of. So I don't like this kind of assisted dying. I don't think assisted dying tells us anything. I think we should be specific about what we are in favor of and what we are against. I suppose the only place where I'd say assisted suicide is better than euthanasia is in that we're absolutely certain that it is the action of the person who is dying rather than somebody else, that it is certainly their decisions. Now, as a historian, I can look back in history and say, well, euthanasia was used for many people against their will or with their assent, but not by their own action. So I think assisted suicide is less dangerous in that way, in that it prevents anybody from being sort of railroaded into the action, whereas euthanasia has and will be used to sort of say, you agree with this, don't you? And the person takes the action, whereas it's a much more dramatic step to end your own life. And I think it's more, it's a better situation that you have in the United States than it is, for instance, in Canada and everywhere else in the world except for Switzerland.
You said something interesting in your book, and I kind of want to get a better understanding of it. So it has something to do with the fact that you think suicide should be like a private act. So this is the passage. You say, "So here's perhaps the most important reason to condemn the legalization of assisted suicide. In attempting to redefine self-destruction in neutral terms as medical treatment rather than a dramatic act, it robs us of our ability to judge, to come to some collective decision on the rightness or wrongness of the suicide. If we cannot judge acts of self-destruction as good or bad, it prevents a moral dialogue between us and threatens to determine the very basis of our relationship with the world. Human action becomes no more meaningful than a disease." Can you elaborate on that?
Well, yes, part of this is because other work that I've done is, for instance, on gun crime. Now, gun crime is not a disease. I think it's wrong to medicalize gun crime. I think it's wrong to medicalize suicide. And I think when you medicalize something, you reduce it to a level where there's no human agency whatsoever. Whereas I think with assisted suicide, there is a sort of agency that is involved in the whole, with suicide, sorry, not with assisted suicide. With suicide, there is agency. There are many, many cases, of course, as we know, that aren't about agency. There are people who are mentally ill. There are people with in very invidious situations where we might argue that their agency was not full. But there are cases where it is entirely that person's choice. And so I think that's one element of it, is that it removes the agency. To medicalize it removes the agency. The other that I think I was talking about with that passage is that I think it's right that we judge. If there is any kind of moral relationship between you and I, and you take an action that I don't think is right, then I think I should judge your action, and I should tell you that I think that action is wrong. And we do that. I sort of go with a Kantian idea that there is a background of morality that we all relate to, that we are all moral beings in some ways. So, for instance, if you say, I'm going to go commit adultery, I would say that's wrong. I don't think that's a right act to do. And you might say, it's my body, my choice. And, yes, it is ultimately. But on the other hand, I can judge it as wrong. And I think we should judge human actions as good or as bad, or, and taking a life is a very, very profound step. I think this is another aspect of assisted suicide that it is wrong. It's that it reduces what should be a profound and awe-inspiring action of taking a life into something that is a menu choice or is a treatment option. And I think that's entirely wrong. One thing I'm going to write about in the future that I think would be interesting is to look at assisted suicide versus capital punishment, because I think capital punishment is much more respectful of the individual than is assisted suicide. Capital punishment takes it so seriously that it will go through 14 years on average between a person being sentenced to die and them actually, most people spend at least 14 years on death row. I think that's taking a life very, very seriously, even though many of the people who are actually are on death row are the scum of the earth, and not people whose lives that we wouldn't care if they lived or died, and we might even cheer if they died because the world would be a better place. But to take that life is a very, very serious act, and I think at least capital punishment shows respect for human life in a way that assisted suicide and euthanasia doesn't.
I want to dive a little deeper into this point that you make about something being a medical option and therefore it becomes morally neutral, right? You're saying that we ought to judge each other's actions. If you want to commit adultery, I would judge you and say, it's bad, you shouldn't do that. But if we legalize assisted suicide and it becomes medicalized, then we were unable to do that. At least that's what it sounds like. That sounds like what you're saying, and that seems a little odd to me. And the reason is because at least in my experience, I think it's quite common for us to judge other people's medical decisions, right? Abortion is one of the most controversial ones. That's a medical decision. Half the country in the U.S. is against it. They obviously think that it's wrong. They think it's murder, right? And maybe like gender transitioning. I think a lot of people have moral judgments about that. So I guess I'm just not saying like why the fact that it becomes medicalized precludes moral judgment.
Well, I think the examples that you use are interesting. I think with abortion, again, I disagree with the way it's put by many people. Many people say it's my body, my choice. It's a medical thing. I don't think it is. I think we license doctors to take what is in fact medically unnecessary. Having a baby is not a life-threatening condition in most cases. So therefore, it's not medically necessary operation. And yet, I think it's socially necessary. I think for women to play an equal role as men, they must have some sort of control of their fertility. So therefore, it's socially necessary. It's a political thing rather than a medical action. So, I mean, I also think the gender issue is as well a very similar kind of issue. I don't think it's a straightforward medical decision to, for instance, remove a person's genitals or in other situations, there can be a profound psychiatric reason for doing so. I'm not opposed to it in all of these situations, but I think often these are reduced to social decisions, and medically it's not necessary. So the question is, do we license doctors to do these acts, which have to include cosmetic surgery, of course, as well, because that's not a necessary thing, but it can be very helpful to the patient in terms of their overall recovery and their psychiatric condition. So I think those are very interesting, and I don't think any of them should be menu choices, and all of them are ultimately subject to the doctor's decision rather than just the patient's decision. And I don't like the idea that death should be medical treatment. I just don't think it's ever good for a patient or in the patient's interests, as often I hear it, to be dead. I don't think we can judge that. I mean, I defy the philosopher to go and prove that case, because it's impossible.
Yeah, no, you definitely touched upon a lot of interesting stuff there. I think the point that I was trying to make is just like the fact that something is medicalized doesn't mean that people don't morally judge it. So for instance, let's say somebody has cancer and they don't want to receive chemo, right? I think it's perfectly reasonable, and it probably happens all the time, that perhaps certain family members are very upset if they hear that. It's like, what? Like, why would you not do that? You have a 30% chance of recovery, of being cured of this cancer. Like, why would you not do that? Like, it's so wrong of you. You're going to harm the people who you leave behind, right? So I don't see assisted suicide or euthanasia different from declining treatment in that respect, right? Like if it becomes legalized and some family member says that they want it, other family members say, oh, like, why? Like, that's terrible. You should never do that, right? So I just feel like it's just natural for us to morally judge other people's decisions, whether or not they're medical.
Well, I agree with you, and I think I would judge the person who is making that decision. I think that it's absolutely right to do that. I suppose the point I'm making is that legally, I think people must be able to make their own decisions. So, for instance, drinking yourself to death, I would say, is a terrible thing. It's a bad thing. But I don't think we should be preventing people. And in fact, in my own experience, it's impossible to prevent somebody from going down that path who's determined to go down that path and who does not respond to any entreaties. And I don't think it's right that we would remove that person's liberty, and that's the part that I don't think is right. It's not so much the moral judgment. I would morally judge somebody who does that, and I do, and I think it's entirely legitimate. But what I think is the objectionable part is preventing them from doing something that they, as an autonomous adult, have a right to do.
The other thing that you mentioned that I want to get your thoughts on is the benefit of death, right? Death being in someone's best interest. So I think the case is probably most clear when a patient is just suffering so much, and then perhaps they're not even going to live that long anyway, right? So let's say a case of like infants, they just, for whatever reason, like they have some sort of genetic condition, they have some sort of, I don't know, defect, I don't know what it is, but we have reasonable belief that this infant is suffering. They don't have the capacities to like understand the suffering or make sense of the suffering, and they're not going to live very long anyway, right? It seems like in cases like that, it's hard for me to deny that death would be in the patient's best interest.
There are certainly cases where death is in the patient's best interest. You're probably familiar with the policeman's dilemma or fireman's dilemma, it's sometimes presented as, whereby a policeman comes by a burning truck with somebody stuck in the cab which they can't get out, and they beg the policeman to shoot them to prevent the suffering. Obviously, it's the right thing to do for that policeman to shoot that person. There are situations like that, there's no question. I find it more difficult with infants because in some ways then you have other considerations. So the sort of cause célèbre cases that I've heard about are where the parents disagree with the doctors. And I think that parents should have some sort of they have as much understanding about whether living is in the infant's best interest as the doctors do. Doctors can prevent suffering, they can prevent pain from happening, and maybe that's what the doctors should be doing. I just think it's very dangerous to say it's definitely in this patient's best interests in a court of law to die, because I just don't think that we can generally make that decision, except, as I say, in very exceptional cases.
Yeah, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that philosophically, it's not problematic. Like if you think death can be bad for someone, then you should think that death can be good for someone as well, right? So the way that I view it is that death is bad for us because it deprives us of the good things in life. And that's deprivationism. That's kind of like the main view of the badness of death, right? And so the flip side is that death is good for someone to the extent and because it deprives them of future like negative well-being or ill-being.
But how can you ever say that there will certainly be negative being? And this is one of the basic difficulties that I have, is that I think we can never say that death is good. I don't think there is a certain circumstance where death is good. I do think that, for instance, as I say, there are exceptional cases, I will admit that, but I think, again, my emphasis is on society's moral understanding, society's rules, society's law has to say that life is good and we preserve life when we can. And I think many of the issues, I don't think it's the equivalent. You say that death is good because it allows us to do fun things, whereas I think life is good for many different reasons, but more importantly, everybody else's life is good for me as a living person. And I think as living people, we have to say we preserve life, and that is one of our basic values. And when you stop that value, you can create all sorts of difficult issues that come up. And I really disagree that there is such a thing as death being in somebody's interest, except in these most exceptional cases where there is certain suffering going on. And then take an exceptional action. If the doctor really knows that this infant is suffering, it can't be that difficult to take the action. Take that action, take responsibility for your action, and just say that this was, I did this in the name of preventing suffering. It should be always subject to legal scrutiny, these kind of decisions. And I think that's where I think medicalization can be very harmful. It removes legal scrutiny. A very good example of that in Canada that I think illustrates part of the problem is that there's a 27-year-old woman, you might have heard of this case in Calgary, who has requested euthanasia. She requested it from the first two doctors. One said yes, one said no. She applied for it later. One said yes, one said no. And there was a tie break, And the doctor who had said yes from the first set of doctors was drafted in, and he said yes. And so they decided that her euthanasia could go ahead. 27 years old, and her parents said, well, why? Why is this euthanasia going ahead? We know her. There's no medical problems that we know of. She lives with us. She has since birth, basically. And of course, because it's a medical decision, nobody can second guess it. Nobody can gainsay it. Nobody can really question it. It's a medical decision. And that becomes the real problem, is that this is obviously a doctor making a decision for a particular reason, but we can't know anything about it because medical records are rightly private. And I think this is how medicalization can really create problems, is that it removes something that should be in the public sphere into that private doctor-patient relationship. And that's not even an equal relationship. So I think that's where it can also become problematic. Your doctor, you are never the equal when you are with your doctor. Not even a doctor is an equal when they go to their doctor. And you're very suggestible, particularly if you've been through a lot of treatments. So I think this is another problem that comes with medicalization.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think there's like an important distinction to be made between kind of like the metaphysical claim about like whether or not death can be good for somebody, and the epistemological claim about how we actually know, or can we know, that death is good or bad for somebody. I think without some sort of commitment to the sanctity of life position, I think you would probably, have to grant some sort of symmetry between the goodness and badness of death, right? Because if you say that, well, we can't know that death is good for anybody or this particular person, then you would equally have to say we don't know that life is going to be good for this particular person, right? If you, unless you're committed to some sort of sanctity of life position, which in which case you believe in some sort of intrinsic value of being alive, right?
Absolutely, and I do think that there's an intrinsic value of being alive, and I would argue that everybody really actually does think that, because we know no other things, and we all live lives where we are making decisions daily, we're doing things. And one of the interesting things as a historian is to see that that was an assumption that held good up until the 1970s. And it's people assumed that being alive was a good thing, and suddenly people started doubting, well, maybe being alive isn't a great thing. And now you have a movement which you may be familiar with, which is the anti-natalists, which is anti with an I, who think that being born is a terrible affliction, and that it's a terrible thing to actually bring people into this world. There's also a crossover between Malthusianism, population concern, and with this antinatalism, and with assisted suicide and euthanasia. And it's something, again, I've looked at historically. When the eugenics movement took off in the beginning of the 20th century, assisted suicide and euthanasia, in fact, it was only called as euthanasia then, was just described as negative eugenics. We need to get rid of the weak parts, and that human life was not intrinsically good, and that we need to, prevent the weak parts from coming at it. But now we have an unprecedented situation where people are saying, human life, how can we assume that it's a good? Why is it good to bring somebody into this world? Whereas I strongly think that it is good to bring people into this world. And I think every human being is a problem solver. Every human being is an heir to the previous generation and to the present generation, and future generations will carry on the human legacy. I think it's an anti-human kind of perspective that we're in the throes of right at the moment.
Okay. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for asking such hard questions and testing me. I enjoy these because much of the rest of my time is spent talking about Section 2 of the policies, this, that, the other. So I'm so pleased to be able to talk more in depth about it, and you have presented some very challenging questions, so I thank you for that.